Is Lisa Lutz, and I am the SVRI Forum and Partnership Lead. Thank you for being here with us today for this learning session on climate change and its intersections with violence prevention, which also marks the final webinar in the SVRI Forum 2026 Road to Bangkok series, co-funded by the Sexual Violence Research Initiative and the Australian Volunteers Program. This series reflects what the SVRI Forum does best, creating thoughtful, evidence-informed spaces for learning, dialogue, and connection across regions and disciplines. We are grateful to our wonderful partners here today for the shared commitment to learning, reflection, and exchange that has shaped these conversations over the last few months. Recordings from the earlier sessions in the series are available online, and Paula will share the links in the chat for us. Before we begin, I briefly want to take us through a few practical notes. So Paula, if you could take it over to the housekeeping slide for me. Thank you. Today's session will run for 60 minutes. The session is being recorded and will be shared publicly on SVRI platforms. For this reason, we kindly ask that no additional note takers are brought into the webinar. Participants are muted, but we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, including your name and where you are joining from. Today's session is available in English, and live captions are available via the Show Captions option in your Zoom toolbar. We welcome your questions and reflections throughout the session, so please feel free to either use the Q&A box or the chat, and we will bring as many of your questions into the discussion as time allows. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sujata Tulada, who will be opening and moderating today's session. Sujata is a senior advisor at the United Nations Population Fund, Asia Pacific Regional Office, where she works on preventing and responding to gender-based violence across the region. Sujata is part of the SVRI Forum 2026 co-host collective, along with the Southeast Asia Gender-Based Violence Prevention Platform and UN Women. She brings deep regional experience and a strong evidence-informed perspective to today's discussion. Thank you, Sujata, and over to you.
Thank you, Liesl, and welcome, everyone. So lovely to see so many of you join this learning session. I see already 128 colleagues joining, and I'm sure there are others also coming in. So thank you very much. This means a lot. As Liesl mentioned, today's session is focused on climate change and its intersection with violence prevention and research and practice. And it's also the final webinar, as Liesl said, in the current series. So I'd also like to echo our joint appreciation to the Australian Volunteers Program for supporting this space for shared learning and for SVRI for taking this forward. This conversation today sits within the wider journey towards SVRI Forum 2026, which is led by the Sexual Violence Research Initiative with co-hosting partners, the Southeast Asia GVV Prevention Platform and the UN Joint Program on GVV Prevention in Southeast Asia, led by UNFPA and UN Women in Asia Pacific and supported by the Australian government. So for those who may be newer to the SVRI Forum community, I'd like to take a moment to share with you a bit about the SVRI Forum. So colleagues, the SVRI Forum is really a global convening held every 2 years. It brings together researchers and practitioners, policymakers, funders and activists working to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, violence against children, and other forms of violence rooted in gender inequality. And the forum is designed as a learning space to share evidence, contextual learnings across regions and sectors, and very importantly, to build the relationships that sustain this work over time. I think many of us who've been part of the previous SVRI forums really cherish this opportunity to be with the larger GVV community and learn from each other. So in that sense, we are also very, very excited that the upcoming SVRI Forum 2026 will take place in Bangkok, Thailand, from the 5th to the 9th of October 2026. You can see the details here on the slide, and the links will also be provided in the chat. I'm just so excited, and it's really, really wonderful to have SVRI Forum return to Asia after a very, very long time. Those of us who are based in Bangkok cannot wait to have this come. So just in terms of where we are in the journey so far, the abstract submissions have now closed. Very happy to note that we have over 2,000 abstracts that were submitted. It's quite a record number. The registration for attendance are still open, and there are also other opportunities to engage through participant-driven events and exhibition booths, as well as structured opportunities for networking, collective care, learning, and exchange. So I really hope you're considering to join us in Bangkok in October. Now, coming back to the session today, this session builds on learnings from SVRI Forum 2024, where climate change emerged as a very strong cross-cutting issue, shaping violence, prevention, and response. And today's discussion is really built on the evidence that was shared during the 2024 SVRI Forum, particularly with regard to the linkage between climate stresses and the increased risks of gender-based violence, and with a specific focus on women and girls in marginalized communities. During the 2024 forum, there were presentations that really highlighted that climate justice and gender justice are deeply interconnected, and really put a spotlight on the importance of community-led, ethical, and action-oriented research, especially in humanitarian and climate-affected settings, as a cornerstone for this work. So with that framework, today's discussion is meant to offer a space to carry that learning forward, and as we continue to prepare for the upcoming Forum 2026. So with that, let me briefly walk you through today's flow. We have two amazing speakers in today's session. Each of them will be presenting for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and reflections from the audience. So with that, let's get us started. It is really my pleasure to introduce to you Naomi Clugston, who is a senior technical specialist at Social Development Direct, working at the intersection of gender-based violence, climate change, and inclusive governance. Her work focuses on strengthening the integration of GBV considerations into climate policy, programming, and evidence generation. Welcome, Naomi. Very, very happy to have you with us. We also have with us Josephine Kamisya, who is the Executive Director and the founding member of the Center for Domestic Violence Prevention in Uganda. And she brings nearly 2 decades of experience mobilizing communities to prevent violence against women. And her work focuses on supporting partners to scale evidence-based prevention approaches and strengthen survivor-centered response at community and institutional level. It's so amazing to have such expertise and experience with us for this learning session. So I'm not going to keep you away from it. Let's get started. Can I turn to you, Naomi, for your presentation? I'm really looking forward to your ideas about why climate actors should address GBV through their work. Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can see, can everyone see my screen? Is that, yes, fantastic. So I want to say thank you hugely to SVRI for having us and for that very kind introduction. As Sujata shared, my name is Naomi Clugston. I work with Social Development Direct, and I'm speaking today in my capacity as a researcher on the Ending Violence Against Women and Children Helpdesk, which is part of the FCDO-funded What Works to Prevent Violence Impact at Scale programme. So as a field, we know that climate change and environmental degradation are risk multipliers that exacerbate the drivers which drive GBV. And in the past year, there have been some significant policy changes in the climate space that also make that link. So, for example, the Gender Action Plan for COP30 has integrated explicit language for the first time on the importance of addressing GBV through climate action. However, the opportunities to engage at this intersection often feel like they remain few and far between. We know that while funding for GBV programs is diminishing, funding for climate programs is not. And so this presentation really is aiming to support us as a GBV field to think about how we can better engage with the climate space, to advocate for addressing GBV through climate and environmental programs, and also how to best work with climate actors when the opportunities to do so arise. And so today's presentation is going to involve two parts. So the first we're going to share some key messages about putting the case to climate actors on the importance of addressing GBV through climate and environmental action. And these messages come from a report that was commissioned by the FCDO and DFAT, and which was launched at COP29 at the end of 2024. It's based on interviews with 28 individuals who are working at this intersection, including women climate activists on the ground. And you can access that report through the QR code, which I have put on each of the slides and which we checked work before this webinar. So please do have a look at the report if you'd like. Okay, so during the second part, my colleague Jojo from SEDAVIP in Uganda is going to be sharing her experiences of then integrating the SAST GBV prevention intervention into a wetlands restoration programme in Uganda, and some lessons which are applicable more broadly on working with climate stakeholders. And we are hoping that there will be some time for questions at the end, but if there aren't, then we will make sure that there are opportunities to continue this conversation moving forward. Okay, so starting with the messaging, we organised this report based on 4 kind of broad categories of climate and environmental programming. So we start off with adaptation and resilience, which are programmes focused on protecting the environment and supporting communities to adapt and remain resilient in the face of climate shocks. We then look at climate-induced disaster programmes, so disaster risk management for climate-induced disasters like floods. We also look at work which involves climate and environmental activists. And then lastly, we look at kind of efforts towards a just transition to a low carbon economy, which often involves things like green infrastructure and energy projects. And then for each category of programme, we have developed tailored messaging on the importance of addressing GBV with examples on the ground. And we have also collected emerging examples of practice-based learning about how to address GBV through that work effectively. So the overarching message is that while climate change exacerbates the factors that drive GBV, GBV can also undermine the goals of climate and environmental action. And there is a section in the report that talks about how climate change exacerbates the factors that drive GBV, but I'm not going to talk about that today. What we found is that framing on how GBV undermines the goals of climate and environmental action is really important when you're trying to demonstrate why addressing GBV is really crucial to achieving the outcomes that climate stakeholders really, really care about. So as a high-level summary of the messaging, about why addressing GBV can really strengthen the goals of climate and environmental action, there are 5 key points. So the first is that it supports women, girls and gender diverse people's equal decision-making, leadership and participation in climate and environmental programming. The second is that it strengthens community and household resilience to climate shocks. The third is that it supports efforts to keep whole communities safe during climate-induced disasters. The fourth is that it enables climate activists to work without fear or intimidation. And the final one is that it contributes to this just transition to a low carbon economy by minimising the harm associated with that transition. Now, since the launch of that report, we have continued to be working in this area. And one of the things we've been doing is working to better understand the variety of programming across the environment and climate sector, which is incredibly broad, in order that we can identify some entry points for addressing GBV. And since many of us in this webinar may not have engaged with the sector before, I just wanted to give a really brief overview of the types of programming that we mean when we talk about the environmental and climate sector. So there are programs, for example, like conservation. So conservation could involve preventing deforestation, restoring wetlands, protecting biodiversity. There are programs focused on something that's called the blue economy. So that would be things like training on sustainable fishing practices or marine agriculture, so harvesting seaweed. There's a type of programming called climate smart, focused on kind of climate smart agriculture. So that could involve training on drought tolerant crops or sustainable livestock management. There's a whole area on nature-based solutions, which is where we're using nature to reduce CO2 emissions and to improve environmental protection and to prevent environmental degradation and the risks of disasters. So as an example of this, wetlands absorb carbon, and so they're known as carbon sinks. So very healthy wetlands can help us reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere because they absorb that carbon and hold it within the wetland. Conversely, as wetlands are destroyed, they release that carbon back into the air. And so there's a huge importance to protecting wetlands, both to absorb carbon that is already in the atmosphere and also to prevent excess greenhouse gases being released. Other forms of nature-based solutions include things like planting trees to reduce soil erosion, or rewilding rivers to connect with floodplains, which can then reduce flood risks. Another type of programming is green infrastructure and energy. So people tend to know about this, kind of solar panels, wind farms, green transport networks. And then there's anticipatory action. And anticipatory action is a really interesting type of programming, because unlike other forms of humanitarian context or humanitarian disaster, in the context of climate-induced disasters, we have the technology now to be able to predict and anticipate when disasters are going to happen. So if we take the example of flooding, when it comes to a river that is flooding every year and is getting more and more aggressive and severe in the context of climate change, we can measure the level of the water, and as the water level rises, that can trigger different responses. So anything from a very early warning system that says to a community that the flood is likely to happen within a certain time frame, right the way through to activities like evacuation drills and scenario planning with communities, so that communities are involved and can be prepared in advance for what they should do in the event of a flood. And then I've also put climate finance down here. And climate finance, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but there are a range of mechanisms that are very specific to the climate space about which is funding these kinds of programming. So anything from green bonds to carbon markets. And while I'm not going to go into it in detail now, I think it's worth, as a field, us really becoming more familiar with these different ways of financing, because the decisions that are being made about the type of programming that is going ahead, there is influence that can be had at that climate finance point and in the design of climate finance. So that's just to say that it's, especially in the context that we are facing as a GBV field in terms of funding, becoming familiar and comfortable with the different mechanisms for climate finance is something that I think is really important for us. So we, the VAWC Helpdesk, are currently in the process of developing a how-to note in collaboration with the Clean Helpdesk, which is the climate helpdesk. And these are both funded by the FCDO. And we're collaborating to develop a how-to note that is going to be really identifying these entry points, and which will also be sharing specific case studies and hypothetical scenarios where case studies don't exist about how we can address GBV, anywhere from GBV risk mitigation all the way to a kind of multi-year social norms, fully fledged prevention programme. And we're hoping to be able to have this as a kind of first port of call for climate actors to be able to think through what they can realistically do within their timeframes and with the resources that they have. So that's just to say that that's coming, so you can look out for that. Anyway, back to the original report. Just going through those kind of 4 key messages for those 4 categories that we talked about. So the first one is that addressing GBV strengthens programmes that are intended to support the environment while supporting communities to adapt and remain resilient in the face of climate shocks. So we know that community-based programming with gender equal decision-making results in better climate outcomes that reflect the diverse needs of whole communities. So, for example, there was a survey of 440 forest users in Indonesia, Peru, and Tanzania, which found that when at least half of decision makers were women, more trees were conserved. We also know that community and household resilience relies really heavily on women's resilience to climate shocks. So the FAO estimates that women produce between 60 and 80% of food production for families in the global south, and so are critical to household food security, which climate change puts at risk. So when we're thinking about things like climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture, including women in both the decision making and also the capacity building and training is really crucial for supporting that household resilience and to protecting land from environmentally harmful practices. But what we also know is that GBV poses a really significant barrier to women's leadership and participation in efforts, whether that's related to decision making or related to training. So those who are facing or recovering from violence cannot or may choose not to engage in activities, while others may be reluctant to engage in activities that increase their risk of facing violence. And we heard through interviews climate practitioners and women's rights organisations in Cambodia and Laos who explained that many women avoid public meetings aimed at developing community approaches to climate shocks due to threats of violence from male community members and husbands. And in addition, programs that don't consider GBV in their design can actually totally fail in their aims to protect the environment and build the resilience of communities. So one of the most compelling examples of this that we found in the report is this wetlands restoration project in Uganda that sought to stop communities from farming the wetlands by providing them with alternative livelihoods. And the program didn't consider GBV and sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment risks that were associated with those alternative livelihoods. And so some women and girls who were participating in the project were subjected to an increase in intimate partner violence and community backlash and sexual exploitation from local landowners. And as a result, many returned to farming the wetlands where they felt safer. And so, and in this instance, the programme failed to strengthen the resilience of communities, causing harm to multiple women, and then also failed to protect the wetlands by stopping communities farming it because so many women returned to it. And what we will hear, so lots of practitioners we spoke to agreed that had the programme considered and addressed GBV through this work, then it would have been better able to achieve its aims. And I'm not going to go into the kind of lessons learned of that because later Jojo is going to be talking about this experience and the programme that she is working on and leading on, which is really built on the lessons and the challenges that came from this experience. So the second message is that addressing GBV supports efforts to keep whole communities safe during climate-induced disasters. So in advance of climate emergencies, survivors of GBV can face real barriers to engaging in disaster preparedness activities due to safety concerns, injuries, stigma, risk of discrimination and backlash. And that can exclude them from anticipatory action activities such as evacuation drills and can prevent them from receiving information and resources that would be essential for their survival and the survival of their families in crisis. Following climate-induced disasters, we also know that GBV and SEAH risks increase from intimate partners, community members and humanitarian responders. And there were various really devastating stories of where we heard about that happening in practice and the implications of that. So we also know, in addition to these risks, that anticipatory action creates really clear entry points for addressing GBV. So Oxfam Cambodia's disaster risk management work with communities who are at risk of flooding includes integrating GBV planning and response into flood simulation exercises and evacuation drills. So they brought communities together to plan and practice how to respond in times of flooding. And as part of that, community groups were identifying where the nearest GBV response services are, developing referral pathways for GBV survivors in times of crisis, and also identifying groups who could provide interim first aid support to survivors until they were able to access official services. Okay, so the third really kind of key tailored message is that addressing GBV enables climate activists to work without fear or intimidation. So our research found that GBV is consistently used to silence the work of climate activists and environmental human rights defenders. And this violence happens online and offline, and it targets women, girls, and gender diverse climate and environmental activists themselves, but also their families and their dependents. So online abuse can lead to self-censorship, and interviews with women environmental human rights defenders told us that the risks that they face at in-person GBV are so great that they cannot continue their work without addressing them. And so as a result of this, many of them are already taking action to protect themselves and their colleagues, but with limited resources and support. So for example, one organisation in Indonesia told us that they had provided office space as a shelter for members of their organisation who had survived instances of GBV linked to their activism. And in practice, there are a variety of ways to support climate activists and environmental human rights defenders to anticipate and deal with the threat of GBV so that they can continue their work safely. So one example is Peace Brigade International, who deploy human rights observers to accompany environmental human rights defenders to reduce the risk of attacks against them, and also work to raise the profile of women activists in order to reduce the ability of governments and large corporations from committing violence with impunity. Okay, so the fourth and final message is that addressing GBV supports this just transition to a low carbon economy by reducing and minimizing the risk of harm caused by that transition. So there's lots of evidence that SEAH risks in clean energy and infrastructure projects, which are often male dominated or require large scale construction. And this can, of course, undermine community trust and lead to reputational damage. In addition, the transition to a green economy is likely to result in job losses within sectors that have adverse environmental impacts, which are also often male-dominated. So, for example, historically, following the closure of mines, there is often, we've seen an increase globally in intimate partner violence. So we need to be really careful and in considering how to mitigate these risks in order to achieve a just transition that supports the human rights of all people. And then finally, the just transition creates lots of opportunities in the green economy, which would really benefit from the expertise of women working across different sectors. But the risk of GBV and SEAH within green industries also poses a significant barrier to their engagement. So there was a 2022 survey which found that 58% of female climate scientists who have been subjected to online abuse and harassment experienced a loss of productivity at work, with 25% dreading work and 27% saying they were less likely to speak in public about climate issues. So addressing GBV is also really crucial for those who are trying to ensure that this transition to a low carbon economy is truly just, does no harm, and supports the participation of women and gender diverse people as crucial experts in this space. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the case for why climate actors should address GBV through climate and environmental action. But the report does go on to present how this can be done in practice. I've shared a few examples today, but there are more in the report. To date, we have not found any programs at this intersection that have been evaluated. And so it's not possible currently to establish the impact of these different approaches on either reducing GBV or on climate outcomes. And this is a really significant gap in evidence, especially since understanding the impact on climate outcomes is what climate stakeholders, funders, and decision makers are consistently telling us they most care about. There are some evaluations through VAWC 2 that will speak to this, but for this report, we've drawn really heavily on practice-based learning from the ground and also identified learning from other relevant sectoral programs which are relevant to or would carry over to the climate and environmental space. I have included a diagram in the right-hand side of this presentation, and I don't think it translates particularly well to a PowerPoint, so my apologies for that. It can be found in the report. It just summarises all the approaches to addressing GBV in climate and environmental programming that we found. So yeah, if you're interested in an infographic, please do explore the report. And then additionally, as I have mentioned already, we're also developing this how-to note, which will have case studies on addressing GBV through climate and environmental action. So if you have any suggestions for case studies or that we should include, or any reflections on this, we would love to hear from you. That is very much in process and hopefully will be launched this year. Okay, so that's the end of my part of this presentation. So I would now like to pass over to Jojo to speak about her experience of integrating a GBV prevention program into a wetlands restoration project.
Hi, thank you, Naomi, for that rich background, and I'm happy to take us through the next step. All right, so I'll share the side of its story and experience of our work with government of Uganda to prevent GBV and ensure wetland restoration programs are successful. So back like about 5-6 years back, we had a partnership with UNDP in Uganda that was directly funding the wetland restoration programs in Uganda. And this is happening in 24 districts. And government had a strategy that they thought that if it was to work, they needed to do something to encourage community members to move away from wetlands. So in their design, they thought that since people have been using wetlands as a source of farming, food security, and also fuel, they thought that just pulling them out would seem unfair and it would not be sustainable, and thought that it would be important to introduce something for them to use as a source of income, but also to ensure that they have food security. So in their design, they provided alternative livelihoods that included cattle, chicken farming, fishing, and other forms of farming. Along the way, there were hiccups because even families and communities that received alternative livelihoods, it was short-lived and they continued going back to the wetlands. And in their observation, there was no study done, but in their observation, they identified that GBV was a problem, specifically domestic violence. And so the women and men in these communities couldn't make joint decisions on how to use the provided alternative livelihoods to support the families to have food and source of income and stay away from farming or cutting trees for fuel, to ensure that the wetlands are restored. So in this partnership, we conducted a formative study that actually supported to reveal that there was a connection between climate risks and GBV, and that it was important to address both GBV and climate risks for the wetland restoration program to thrive. In that partnership, it ran up to 2021, but that was the COVID time. And so after the formative study and having the results and thinking with government and about how to work and have a strategy for us to use, we had 2 years of lockdown, and so the program ended, and we ended at a stage where we had just developed a strategy and didn't implement. And that is how we picked it up, because the recommendation was that we can find more fundraising and continue the collaboration with government because we already have a partnership. So we carried on the partnership, and from that, we learned that programs that do not address GBV while doing climate change programming or preserving the environment are less likely to be successful, and learn that addressing GBV can improve the safety of alternative livelihoods. So if there is no GBV at household level, then it is likely that the provided livelihoods will serve the purpose of supporting families, especially where both men and women in these families make joint decisions, and ensure that the provided livelihoods support the family. And then we also learned that they increase the sustained uptake of the restoration efforts. Now, currently, we are piloting in one district. I'll be speaking to that a little bit later. But then we learned that for sustainability, all stakeholders, including women, children, elders, institutions, and all the structures in the community need to be engaged into changing their norms, to learn how to use their power positively to to create healthy relationships at household level where both men and women can make joint decisions, but also positively use or manage the wetlands. So that way, when they go through that transformation and learning, they are able to see it as a community and agree that they need to move away from the wetlands. And then they also, when we prevent GBV, we can strengthen household resilience to climate shocks. So when community members or household members and community members all know the benefits of preserving the environment, the benefit of managing the wetlands, but also when they are confident, especially when the women feel safe and they know that they can make decisions and they are supported with their partners and not abused, then it creates opportunity for them to engage in all activities, including the wetland restoration programs, without fear of consequences or abuse of being questioned where they are going, who gave them permission to go and sit in that meeting that was called by a government or climate actors. So when there is safety in the homes and joint decision making, and especially when women are involved in decision making, then the programs are likely to be sustainable, and then the measures put in place to address the climate risks are likely to be sustained and embraced with the communities. So to address that gap, in our innovation program that is being funded by FCDO through What Works Too, we are still working in partnership with the Ministry of Water and Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture and the Palisade District Local Government. These all have a mandate. The Ministry of Water is responsible for the wetland management. The Ministry of Agriculture is responsible for provision of the alternative livelihood. And Palisade District is where there is the pilot government program of restoring wetlands. And in here, they did lots of different activities that include irrigation, fish farming, cattle, chicken, and other forms of alternative livelihoods that they are giving to the communities. So that's how we come into play with these different three government institutions. And our program is using SAST together, a community mobilization approach, originally developed by Raising Voices, to address intimate partner violence or to mobilize communities to change harmful norms that perpetuate violence. So we have adopted SAST to use it to address social norms, to prevent intimate partner violence, but also to improve wetland management, the norms to improve wetland management. And the program is being evaluated. It's using a quasi-experimental approach in partnership with Makerere University, Equality Institute, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And this will help us to bridge that gap of having evidence. Naomi indicated that we don't have that much evidence. So we are very hopeful that we will have evidence of what it takes to integrate GBV prevention and response in wetland management programs or climate sector programming. Can we move on? So we've learned that environmental behavior change programs are a natural entry points for GBV prevention and social norm change. This is because both GBV and climate are shaped by our beliefs, norms, and attitudes. So the way people relate with fellow human beings within their social interactions or as a community, it is norms that are shaped by our socialization. And the same way, there are beliefs and norms that are attached to the climate and the environment. So it requires a long-term engagement to shift these norms. For example, you will find that in the communities, abuse of women, especially in intimate relationships, but also broadly within a community. For example, when the climate risks like the severe ones that cause displacement, like either drought or floods, women experience lots of abuse, including sex, being coerced to have sex for food, sex for a makeshift house, or a quick one of transactional sex for them to receive food, or sometimes young girls pushed into early marriage for the families to survive. But then also farming in the wetland, many times community members don't attach value. They don't see, this is just a tree. Why wouldn't I cut it? This is a wetland. It's probably in my community, in my land. It has been here for ages. We've farmed here for ages. And so they do not know the appropriate way of managing what crops are appropriate to be put in the wetlands and how, as a community, they can collectively sustain the existence of the wetlands. And so when they are not taken through a social change norm, they feel like government is intruding, it's being unfair, and so the programs do not work. And also when the alternative livelihoods are provided, many times the men feel justified to own them and they use them to their benefit. And so even when communities recognize the consequences of mismanaging of wetlands or the environment, but because at family level, there is no joint decision making about the finances, about the alternative livelihoods, or even how to manage crops from the upland, then families, because the burden is pushed to women and children, so the women feel safer to farm in the wetlands, because many times the wetlands are in no man's land, and so there they have a bit of ownership of the crops grown there, and they can save them. And the men sometimes are less likely to sell the crops while they are still in the garden. And so a bit of food security is also assured. And co-design with climate actors improves relevance and buy-in for the program and evidence. And co-design means we engage with all stakeholders at different levels, including community, the institutions that you're partnering with, for each one to understand what this really takes, what it is, and each one's role. For example, here in Uganda, in our context, the government institutions are not traditionally GBV institutions. So they do not see that connection directly, and we can't simply assume. Many times they think addressing GBV is having both just men and women, but the power analysis is not done. So in this program, it's important to support them to understand what GBV is, the consequences, and why, if it's not addressed, how it also affects the progress of in restoring wetlands, and tailoring messages to different stakeholders is very important. Again, every stakeholder has a different mandate and role to play. And so if the program has to work, it has to be tailored to their mandate so that they feel like it is their own. And all these co-design and tailoring of message increase buy-in, and especially people feeling that their needs are addressed and they feel that they are attached and it's relevant to them. Next. Okay, so for this to be able to happen, we need to build the capacity of the senior climate stakeholders to support the scale. With government, decisions are top-down. So you need to have all the key decision makers that include the leadership of each department that you work with. For example, the Ministry of Water, we are working directly with the Wetland Management Department. And so if you need decisions to be made, you have to work with the commissioners, the assistant commissioners, the department heads, and same with the other institutions, including the district level. And not just writing and giving them info sheets of flyers, you need to take them through a series of intensive training for them to learn and see the connection in how that can be actually realized in their day-to-day work and also enforced at the level of policy making and implementation. And of course, it goes in line with tailoring the curricula to the environmental context to improve their engagement. So you don't speak GBV as usual, but try to connect and maintain the consistency of how the two are interlinked for them to see their relevance. And of course, flexible long-term funding is very important to ensure that enough engagement is done to support this social norm change to happen, to address the two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jojo and Naomi. I mean, that was such a rich set of presentations. If I can invite colleagues, I see some clapping going on here with some applaud. Please use the digital tools to do that because you really do deserve it. Thank you so much. Naomi, amazing case that you've made for climate actors and why they should be addressing GBV and also how addressing GBV enables climate actors to work with that fear of intimidation. Thank you so much for that very concrete set of arguments that you presented. I know that there's a lot of interest for the report and request, so that already shows that the arguments have landed, Naomi. And Jojo, thank you very much. I think in our space, and especially in the SVRI forum, we always are looking for concrete examples and evidence, and that's exactly what you brought here from Uganda, and especially our favorite, SASA, how to address norms through SASA together to improve wetland management. Amazing presentation. I can see just from the engagement in the chat, as well as the Q&A section, that this has sparked a lot of interest, understanding, and also a lot of people have really appreciated bringing this connection together. So well done, both of you. Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time to take some questions, and I see there are quick questions in the chat, in the Q&A, sorry. So let's turn to that. Naomi, can I turn to you if there are a couple of questions that perhaps you would like to respond to, maybe on the climate finance as well as research and evaluation on the impact. Would you like to take any of these? And Jojo, I'll come to you perhaps on these community level engagements on specifically looking at women and girls with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very
happy to. I am just looking at the Q&A now. I'm sorry. I'll just go through it. So the question on climate finance, which is about sharing more information on climate finance, that's a really complex topic, and there's a lot of information. So I don't think here is the right place to answer, but we will have a section on that in the how-to note that we're producing, and we can send something after this webinar to kind of give an overview of the different types of climate finance. But essentially, they are mechanisms by which climate programs are funded, very specific climate funding mechanisms, essentially. I'm just looking at which were the other ones that you suggested I look at?
The question on is there any research or evaluation on the impact of extreme weather events on GBV prevention and protection services? What are the nuances compared to other social services? It's open to both of you. I'm just flagging a few that you may want to start with, and maybe Jojo, you want to come into.
Thank you. No, and I can see that the questions are really detailed. And so I'm sorry, it's hard to read them through quickly. But thank you for sharing them, and we can try and share full answers after this, after the webinar. In terms of research on the impact of in climate-induced disasters on GBV, and also on GBV on the ability of climate kind of risk management to work successfully. There is increasing research and evidence is around the links between how climate change drives the factors that are causing GBV. So how it is driving displacement, how it's driving harmful coping mechanisms, how it's leading to food insecurity, all these things that we know are causing or driving GBV. And that goes for both in all contexts, including in the context of kind of climate disasters and climate shocks. What there is less evidence on consistently is about how addressing GBV actually supports those the efforts to improve resilience for households, to improve disaster risk management or evacuations, the extent to which the actual response to climate change and how we are adapting and remaining resilient to climate change, the extent to which that works. So in terms of research, there's loads out there. You can absolutely, I would recommend if you just have a very quick Google, lots will come up. But most of it will be focused on how climate change is driving GBV rather than on how addressing GBV really supports climate actors achieve their climate outcomes. I don't know if that answers the question, but please.
No, thank you, Naomi. I acknowledge that, maybe each of these questions could be as abstract submission as well. So I understand that's very, very complex, but thank you for taking a stab at them. Jojo, did you want to come in on any of the questions? Perhaps I was thinking maybe on this disability, but please open to whichever you want to come into.
Okay, so with disability, first I would like to say, thank you to everyone. And currently, I know under the VAWC 2 program, there is a program that is being done, and also studies are being done to support designing of the integrating of the disability. It's not very clear on how to do that, but partially what we did in our core design, we had a mix of both women with disabilities and the ordinary community members as stakeholders for us to check and understand the specific needs and content and take their voices of what they think would work for them if it is included in the program. And part of that informed the designing of both the research questions as well as the program tools, and it is still work in progress. But then I think it's really important to pay attention to learning and knowing the context-specific needs, because they are different. Even in the normal setting where there are no people with disabilities, context really matters. They are not uniform needs. each context has very specific needs. And so paying attention to the specific needs of the disability and then how you can do it. But on our side, we actually lean a lot on working with other institutions that are already providing services. So on our side, because we're not skilled in dealing with disability, we identify and refer so that these women or people with disabilities are better supported. But when it comes to addressing GBV, we look at it uniformly and also try to speak to the little specifics that we learn from the voices of the women in the communities. But ultimately, we encourage treating everyone with respect in the SASA methodology and ensuring that no form of abuse is acceptable, irrespective of someone's, whether someone is disabled or not disabled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jojo. Thank you. I couldn't have said it better. Maybe I know that we only have a few minutes left, but there's a really great point here. And sorry for not being able to address all the questions, colleagues, but there's a great point here from Christina that I really wanted to flag here, where she says that unfortunately, climate donors want to count trees planted or carbon sequestered, while social donors want to count attitudinal shifts, and proving that a tree planting initiative actually makes a village safer for women requires a different kind of reporting that many aren't equipped for yet. What can be done, and are there any resources that address this challenge? Any takers?
Yeah, I mean, this is so true. We hear this all the time, and it's really challenging trying to convince and engage with at that intersection, because as you say, the reporting mechanisms, the way that these organizations are kind of set up to fund and to expect reporting are so different. And I think this is why we really want to equip the GBV field, and as a field, we need to kind of come together to advocate more clearly about where the links are and why it should be happening. And that advocacy needs to happen right across from funding level right the way through to practitioner level. So the whole spectrum of people working at this intersection. The how-to note that we'll make sure that we send it to everyone who has been involved. We'll talk to some of these issues, but at the moment there isn't a clear. There isn't an easy answer. We are still very much we are in a moment where we as a GBV field can see that this is important. And so where we are is trying to convince both those social donors and those climate donors to actually engage properly in a way that's safe and effective, but we just need a lot more advocacy and collaborative advocacy as well. So which hopefully through SVRI and these kinds of conversations we'll be able to kind of move forward collectively.
Thanks, Naomi. Did you want to add anything?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also see there's another fantastic point here, which again, these are such amazing conversations to continue. But just to acknowledge this question where Sabina Singh is saying that those who work in the field of understanding gender relations can trace linkages between climate change interventions in GVV, but these linkages, as even Naomi pointed out, by those engaged in climate sector programming are perhaps often missed out. What are some of the alternatives that make this connection more explicit, not only for people engaged in program implementation, but also general public, and alternatively, how the prevention of GVV can be mainstreamed in public consciousness? Thank you so much, Sabina. I think that's a really, really fantastic point. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we'll have much time today to go as in depth as Naomi and Jojo mentioned. Many of these questions could be a webinar by themselves, but that just shows that there's so much interest, and it also, fills our hearts with a lot of hope, because there are lots of us thinking about this and taking this conversation forward. But before we bring this conversation to a close today, let me just take a moment to thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Jojo. Thank you so much for bringing so much food for thought and reflections and very practical examples of what can be done, and some very strong advocacy arguments. Thank you very much. I think that's exactly what we need in the field right now. And I really hope that we can continue these conversations and learnings together in the upcoming SVRI Forum 2026 in Bangkok. If there are any questions about the SVRM Forum or from today's meeting, today's learning session, please do reach out. I think an email address has been put in the chat, but let me just mention it's forums@svri.org. And my colleague Paula has also put here a link to all the previous recordings, as well as a space where this recording will be uploaded. Thank you again, colleagues. This has really, really been very, very rich. Thank you for your very, very active engagement. Do reach out to us should you have any questions. Anybody from the SVRI team, as well as the co-host team, would be able to support you with that. And with that, let's bring this learning session to a close. Thank you very much and hope to see you all in Bangkok in October. Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.